Today, lesson 38, and the final episode of the Kleshas, your misery. So we continue reading the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, chapter 2, Sutra 20. The seer is pure consciousness, but though pure, appears to see through the mind. What is the seer? The seer, that is your soul, your higher consciousness, the omniscient entity inside every human being. We came to the conclusion a couple of times before throughout this course that people without any form of education, people who are illiterate, cannot read or write, can portray, can show an incredible wisdom. So we live in a world where we think that knowledge and insight comes from books, comes from education. According to yoga, that is not the case. Education is good, of course, especially in a systematic way as we know it, but it's very limited. Because everything is subtle, we do not see the limitation. Now, what is described here is the battle between the head and the heart. The seer is pure. The seer in you, the seer in me, is the same. It's pure. So looking at something, it would come to exactly the same insight and exactly the same conclusion whenever contemplating some issue. The limitation is the mind. How do we interpret what we see? How do we interpret what we contemplate? And that is determined generally how we are conditioned, by how we are conditioned. So we are kind of biased in a way, because I am conditioned in a different way than you are. So I will interpret the same information, the same conclusion, in a different way than you do. While the essence of what we're looking at is exactly the same. The mind, our ability to think, that is a special ability that, as far as we know, no other creature on earth possesses. But it's not always working in our advantage, to our advantage. But try to understand how it works. Then from there, you will develop the ability to discriminate between what your mind is telling you and what you're actually feeling. It's just something, it's a kind of a fog that you need to learn to look through. What applies to the soul, what is described here as seer, applies to everything else about how we function. When you feel fear, it's something that happens in your belly. It's a feeling. But it's the mind that interprets that. It's the mind that says, oh, I'm afraid. In the same way, information that comes from the highest level of consciousness, fear is a lower level, higher level allows you to have deep understanding of complex matter, allows you to have a vision of the future based on an understanding of the past. So very sophisticated. But it is only as sophisticated as the mind is capable of interpreting it without distortion, without coloring what it sees. So the mind is in the center, surrounded by all kind of entities that provide signals, that provide information from lower levels that comes in the form of feelings, of emotions. From higher level, it's feeling, vibration, not based on emotion, but based on insight, vision. The mind is in the center of it all and basically functions as an interpreter. Why is this an issue for Patanjali to address? That is because we live in a world where we think the mind is almighty. The mind is everything, which explains why our education system has evolved into a system where the emphasis is on memorization. Just trying to increase theoretical knowledge with little regard for the level of consciousness that lies above it. Education without the seer, without higher consciousness, is still valuable. But we already came to the conclusion that if you are, whatever it is that you do in your profession, if you only function based on the mind, all that you are capable of is simply repeating what you have been conditioned to do. So very limited. However, if you combine that with higher consciousness, you develop the capability to think outside the box. Because the mind puts you in a box, that is your limitation. Thinking outside the box means, based on new insights, contemplating a problem that you encounter in your work, and finding a solution based on the essence, coming to some totally new development. That is genius. And genius, the word in itself, indicates that direct relation to that higher consciousness, because genius means spirit. That's the spirit, that is the soul. In the same way that inspiration is related to this level of consciousness, genius is related to that level of consciousness too. So if you combine education with soul consciousness, it leads to genius. So the majority of the people in science, in all fields of work, professions, majority of the people are in that box. They are trained, they are conditioned to do the same trick again and again, without evolution, without growth, without development. Of course, there is some growth, some development. Practice makes perfect, but very limited, very marginal. It is those few people that combine spirit with mind that come to revolutionary discoveries, inventions. And you see this quality in the great inventors throughout history. if you look a little bit closer at their biography, you see that they all had spiritual tendencies, natural spiritual tendencies, not the kind of dogmatic spiritual tendencies of the established religions, but natural, spontaneous. One does not go without the other. So how do you deal with this? Simply, first of all, try to be aware of how it works and the limitation of the mind. And that understanding in the long term will lead to you more and more trusting, relying what you feel. Trusting, relying more on the subtle aspect of your consciousness that most people are simply not aware of because it is so subtle. But it is the entity inside you that gives you deep insight in yourself and the world around you. Sutra 21 is about the world around you. The very being of the scene is for his sake, for your sake. I mentioned it last week already after the class had already finished, I think, so it was not recorded. But in the Bible it is said that God created the world for man, for humankind. And I said the world is your playground. Play, not frivolously, but consciously from now on. What is the difference? Look around you. Humankind has developed so much control over matter that we have started systematically destroying our environment. There is no seer involved. There is no soul consciousness involved. Only the mind. Disconnected. We dig our own graves without knowing it, thinking we are so intelligent, so smart, making money. We are killing our own environment. So that is not what it means that God created the world for us. Because that phrase includes that you play in that world, but you must respect it also at the same time. A respect that comes very natural when the spirit is fueled with energy from the bottom, when higher consciousness is awakened. Care for the environment at large, in general, comes very natural to the yoga practitioner. The very being of the scene is for his sake. The world is there for you to experience, but consciously. And as a result, we saw last week in the last sutra that we studied that it leads to liberation. From now on, you start living life consciously. You do not think anymore in terms of good and bad, which is the way that we label our experiences normally. You simply use every experience that you have as a learning moment, as a moment to gain insight in the world around you and the way that you relate to that world. Also in yourself, insight in yourself. I think I mentioned before, I don't know if it was last week, that choosing the spiritual path and then spending your whole life in a monastery or a temple is useless. Because your life in the temple leads to a transformation, opening up potentials, opening up qualities and characteristics that are not being put to use. That is why the abbot of the temple or the monastery, the leader of the temple or the monastery, will send you away after 5 years, 10 years, probably closer to 10 years, 15 years. There must come a point you have reached the top of the mountain. It's time to go down the mountain again. Live life in normal society. Not only to serve, but to start building experience, to start building insight, grow, develop, eventually liberate yourself. That's not possible if you stay in the closed environment of a temple or a monastery. You must come down the mountain and expose yourself and serve. Help the ignorant people down the mountain. So the next sutras will expand on that. I may repeat myself, but the more the better, I think. Sutra 22 is interesting also. Although it becomes non-existent for him whose purpose has been fulfilled, it continues to exist for others on account of being common to others. Headache? You understand what is written here? No, it's a warning. It's Patanjali's warning. Never forget where you are coming from. You come from a condition of ignorance, imperfection. This is what happens generally. People who practice yoga, over time, become more and more conscious, more and more sensitive. As a result, you become more and more a perfectionist in a certain sense. Because the more conscious you are, the less mistakes you make. Now this is what happens. It's like when you have a child yourself, or you have a nephew or a niece. If you have a child yourself, you don't see it growing, because you see the child every day. When you were a child also, you didn't see yourself growing. But when you meet an aunt or an uncle who hasn't seen you for a year or so, they always invariably say, "Wow, you grew so much. You became so big." It's the same in your yoga development. You don't see your changes taking place. You don't see your increasing sensitivity, consciousness, and the resulting perfection occurring. In the same way that you didn't see yourself growing bigger and bigger when you were a child. Why? Because you see it 24 hours a day. And 24 hours a day, there are very small changes that in a year time, it makes a big difference. If you see it today and then you see it again next year, there is a very clear difference, comparison. But that comparison, that difference is not there when every time just a little change has taken place. Patanjali is warning here not to become a perfectionist. You become a perfectionist in a natural way, but don't compare yourself to other people. Patanjali is saying those other people, they have not gone through the process that you went through. But now that you have become more flawless, now that you have become more perfect compared to before, you start to see other people's imperfections. And if you don't realize that you yourself was in the same imperfect condition before as the people that you are now looking at, you become judgmental. You become irritable because of people's ignorance, because of people's imperfection. You don't make mistakes anymore, but other people do. Many spiritual people go through a stage where they become arrogant. They become judgmental. They feel they are better than other people. Why? We didn't see the change taking place, and now we start to see other people's imperfection while forgetting that we were exactly like that before. Patanjali is giving a warning here. Do not fall into that trap, because it makes you an ugly yogi. Yes, it's an ugly personality trait, an ugly characteristic to end up like that. So never forget where you're coming from. What does it mean? You have to open your heart. When you see other people with their imperfections, realize that you were like them before. Instead of being judgmental, you would have to feel pity for them. You would have to feel mercy. Can you see that? That is where all the forgiveness and mercy in religion comes from. Instead of being judgmental, try to help. Instead of condemning, try to be understanding. Can you see that? If you don't do that, it leads to a lot of bad energy, conflict, etc. So you keep repeating the same negative cycle. It will happen, because it's only human, but be aware of it. When it happens, try to correct it. Do not let it happen again next time. But it's natural, so also do not self-destroy yourself out of consciousness of your own failure. The same mercy, understanding, and forgiveness you extend to other people, you must also be capable of giving to yourself. So also in that respect, not be a perfectionist. Perfectionism in all its forms leads to blocked energy. So play. You will improve, you will become more flawless, and in a natural way become more and more a perfectionist. But perfectionist is in the eye of the beholder. It's like Yehudi Menuhin. You know Yehudi Menuhin? No? You know? You never opened your Light on Yoga, did you? Yehudi Menuhin wrote the foreword in the Light on Yoga. But who is Yehudi Menuhin? He is famous for his violin playing. 90 years old, he has 80 years, maybe 85 years experience playing violin. If you listen to his playing, you think, wow, this is so perfect. If you ask him, he will say, no, not perfect at all. Here I made a mistake, there I made a little mistake, there I made a little mistake. You didn't hear it, but I know. That is real perfection. Perfection is in the eye of the beholder, but perfection in itself doesn't exist. The better you become at something, the more you see the mistakes you make. So just be human. Yehudi Menuhin. I'm surprised I can't pronounce the name. Does he still live? No. He must be over 100 if he's still alive. So don't pursue perfection. Perfection comes natural as a result of your increasing sensitivity and consciousness. 23. The purpose of the coming together of the Purusha and Prakriti is gaining by the Purusha of the awareness of his true nature and the unfoldment of powers inherent in him and Prakriti. It's a little bit the same story again. The purpose of the coming together of Purusha and Prakriti, that is the reason why your soul has descended from heaven down to earth to live in Prakriti, the material world, is to discover your soul, discover the powers inherent in you, powers that do not manifest but are there. In many people, in the lifetime that they live in, those powers never manifest because they are lost, they are ignorant, they are distracted by superficial elements. But when you start living consciously, every experience, whether we label it good or bad, teaches you something, according to the sutra, about yourself, your real self, your true characteristics, your soul. But it also teaches you about the world around you and how to put that to good use without destroying it. So how did we get lost? How did we get to the point of eternal suffering? To the point that we are digging our own graves by destroying the very environment that sustains us, that sustains life. That is Sutra 24. The cause of all that is the lack of awareness of our real nature. Disconnect. There is a huge disconnect in the world that we live in. Disconnect meaning we are not aware of our soul consciousness. We are focusing on 1 or 2% of what life really is about. We are focusing on the gross element of life, which is the material aspect. Money, status. That is what most of us are mainly busy with. And the other 98%, I don't know if it's an accurate number, or 95%, that is subtle. That is your soul consciousness, that is your spirit. There is so much more to life than the material world, than status and wealth. And when you start to become aware of that, you will always wake up and say, life is wonderful. Even at your most miserable days, even at your deepest depths, at your deepest misery, you will still be grateful and feel that life is wonderful. That's only possible when you have that connection, when you realize that everything has a reason and a purpose, including and especially your misery, your suffering. Your suffering only from this perspective, from Patanjali's perspective, suffering only has the goal, it serves to teach us something about ourselves. Misery is our teacher. The whole world, the material world, all our experiences are our teacher. Patanjali confirms that, but especially misery. The reason why we suffer from misery, which seem to be inseparable, suffering and misery, the reason why we suffer from misery is because of ego. We identify with the misery, which limits our vision enormously, and all we can see is pain. And we drown in the pain, we drown in the misery. When you develop vision, you start to connect the dots. You start to see the law of cause and effect at work. So misery now has a purpose, a positive purpose, not a negative one to just make you drown in pain and misery. It is designed to teach you something that you were not aware of yet. When you start seeing that, that is when you will be able to be grateful and think that life is wonderful even when you're suffering from terrible misery. Can you see that? If you cannot see that yet, it will come, and then I hope you will remember this. If you can see that, it will totally change your perspective next time when life presents you a new bout of suffering, of misery. Okay? That's how you can start making sense out of your misery. Because most people don't see the sense in misery. That is where the expression, when life gives you lemonade, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. It means make something positive out of something negative. Make something sweet out of something sour. And you can, everybody can, but it must be a choice. So what Patanjali says, how do you make lemonade out of lemons? Sutra 25. The dissociation of Purusha and Prakriti brought about by the dispersion of avidya is the real remedy. And that is the liberation of the seer. Got it? The dissociation of Purusha and Prakriti. That means the disconnect. The disconnect is brought about by the dispersion of avidya. Avidya is ignorance. That is the first klesha that lies at the foundation of all our suffering. We need to get rid of our ignorance. How? First and foremost, start practicing yoga. Ignorance is not something that you can get rid of by reading books or getting diplomas. We need to fuel higher consciousness. And based on that, you have deeper insight, and more you start to understand yourself, your misery, your past, and even your future. So we need to get rid of ignorance. Not by studying, reading books, although that is not wrong, but it should only be an aid, it should only be a support. Like you study yoga now. It supports you in understanding what you're actually doing and achieving by practicing and letting energy rise. Opening up consciousness, awakening effect. I already answered the question. Patanjali does it in Sutra 26. How do we get rid of ignorance? The uninterrupted practice of the awareness of the real is the means of dispersion of avidya. You have to work. You have to stay alert. It's so easy to practice yoga and do your best at moments, and then at other moments just fall back into old behavior, old habits. We all do that because it's human. But then you end up suffering again. Every time that you're not alert, that you don't pay attention, you fall off your cord. Let me explain. Yoga is about balance between Shiva and Shakti energy, right? It's about being in sattva, in the center. It's literally like a walk on a tightrope. Do you, Korean people, you understand what walking on a tightrope is? There's a rope that is tied to two sides, and then you have this acrobat that is walking on the rope, right? Balancing. Very difficult. That is yoga. You can compare yoga with a tightrope, walking on a tightrope. We as yoga practitioners learn to walk on that rope. You do. But you notice that with the slightest mistake, you fall off your rope. You lose balance and you fall off your rope. So, as yogis, we keep practicing, but we also keep practicing alertness, not only asana and meditation, but also pay attention. Living our lives, our daily lives, as human beings, we add another dimension, which is consciousness, so that, as Patanjali says, the misery that has not come can and must be avoided. You will see from now on that every time you end up suffering again, you will smile like I do now. I have done it many times. Because since I lost my ignorance, every time I ended up suffering, tremendous suffering, painful suffering, I always came to the conclusion that just for a moment I didn't pay attention. Just for a moment I did it again. Did what? Just being human. Because we're only human. So sometimes you just forget and you lose yourself in old habits and tendencies and just go back to old condition of being human. Why I smile is because always you come to the conclusion that you should pay attention. Every time when I ended up in deep misery, my most important conclusion was I should get back to my yoga mat. Because the misery occurs because just for a while you become distracted because of a new relationship, because of a new job, because of a big move. You become distracted, and before you know it, you end up in deep shit again. Only to come to the conclusion that you have to bring out your yoga mat from the closet, dust it off, and start practicing again. Because when you practice, you sharpen your consciousness and you're much more alert, able to avoid the misery that has come again, that has occurred again. So I always say, I have to reinvent the wheel. And it makes me smile just realizing how stupid you can be sometimes. Not in a negative way, it's just human nature. And practice makes perfect, you get better and better at it. And you learn that there's no such thing as perfection. So you give yourself some slack, allow yourself a few mistakes, but keep learning, keep growing. Sutra 27 is Patanjali offering a method how to do that. I've already said it. He says it, of course, in a very wonderful, poetic way. In his case, the highest stage of enlightenment is reached by 7 stages. The highest state of enlightenment is here meant to be the 8th step, the 8th limb of yoga, which is samadhi. Samadhi is not an exercise, actually it is a condition in which you are whole, in which all levels of your being, all levels of consciousness are working in harmony, functioning in harmony. How do you get to that 8th step, that 8th limb? By following the previous 7. Yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana. So basically he's saying, take out your yoga mat, dust it off and practice. Keep practicing. And the final sutra on the subject from the practice of the component exercises of yoga on the destruction of impurity arises spiritual illumination which develops into awareness of reality. Yeah. For many people, yoga, spirituality is a luxury. It's something that is not related to daily life for most people. It's optional. It's something that you can choose to do when you have time and you have some money and you can go to the studio and practice yoga. Patanjali says, no, no, no. Yoga is crucial in your life. The only way to open up and maintain functioning on a higher level based on soul consciousness, the only way to do that is to integrate yoga into your daily life. And yoga is not only doing your exercise on your mat, asana, pranayama, meditation. You can replace the word yoga with the word life. But not ignorant life, life lived consciously. The life in which you use every experience as a teacher, as a learning moment. Because that's what yoga really means. Yoga is life. Not some superficial kind of thing that you do once in a while, totally separated from the rest of your daily life and of who you are. Because yoga, you become yoga and yoga becomes you. The ultimate fusion or the ultimate union is that you become yoga and yoga becomes you. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Yoga is a way of life. It's not an exercise or a theory or a philosophy. It's something that completely integrates into what you do and who you are. Questions? Okay, I see you're impressed. Take your time to digest all of this. It took me decades. I know you can do it much faster than I did, because I'm very stubborn. But don't be impatient. What this is about is a totally different way of functioning, on all levels of our being. Totally different way of life, but it's not something that you introduce superficially by going to the organic food store, becoming a vegan and these kind of things, which are good, but it should come from your heart and not as just some way to show off, which is the way many people approach yoga. You know, when I started managing the yoga program in the gym next to 63 building, it was a huge gym, 5,000 pyong, so it's one of the biggest gyms in Korea. At the very beginning, my teachers were all trained in Magic Pond. Then the gym introduced a couple of other yoga instructors. Do you know Nadia Yoga? Nadia? She's very famous. Anyway, they wanted to have some more dynamic yoga. Not only traditional yoga, that's how I started there, in a very commercial gym. And I vividly remember one of our instructors saying, they were baffled. They're teaching yoga in their swimming suit. You know, the very fancy, sexy yoga dress was basically a swimming suit. Very revealing. And my teachers were trained in Magic Pond and they had no idea that that was the modern approach to yoga, basically. Very superficial. Anyway, just came to the surface of my memory. The funny experience. The jaw dropped. They're teaching yoga in a swimming suit. The funny thing was, the week after, nobody came back in swimming suits. they felt kind of uncomfortable, exposed. Yeah. Anyway, if you enjoy being an exhibitionist, then enjoy it. Why not? It's not what yoga is about, as long as that is, you remember that. Okay, let's have a short break.